April 1997 brought record flooding to Minnesota. Two of the state's largest rivers overflowed their banks, inundating cities, towns, and farm fields from border to border. The Minnesota National Guard answered Governor Arne Carlson's call to help in what became the largest state mobilization in the Minnesota National Guard's history. The historic floods, described by some as the worst in 100 years, came as no surprise. Weather forecasters and river experts expected severe flooding because of an exceptionally wet autumn and because of record snowfalls during the winter. In fact, the Red River Valley received its final foot of snow during the first week of April. Many state agencies, including the National Guard, developed detailed plans to respond to the floods.
Well, planning really came in three areas. The first was coordination meetings with all the communities and state agencies and county officials that were going to be involved in the flood fight once the forecast came out saying that the floods and the snowmelt floods in the spring of 1997 were going to be, catastrophic or record floods.
The call for help from the governor came in the first few days of April. The Minnesota River began overflowing its banks from Ortonville to Montevideo to Granite Falls. Those communities and their residents needed help that only the Minnesota National Guard could provide. National Guard soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 151st Field Artillery, the 682nd Engineer Battalion, and the 134th Forward Support Battalion moved into Montevideo and built dikes, controlled traffic, provided security, and pumped a lot of water. National Guard soldiers and vehicles also served as important tools in the many evacuations that occurred in that area. The National Guard followed the river crest to Granite Falls, where the flood fight occurred for several days. In about a week, more than 800 National Guard members were on active duty, assisting in the flood fight. Guard members worked alongside community residents and volunteers from around the state to shore up dikes and keep the water out. Granite Falls was the last serious problem in the Minnesota River Valley. But as the Minnesota River was cresting and then receding, the Red River of the North was beginning to boil over its banks. Soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 136th Infantry, were called to Breckenridge when the water began to cover large parts of that city. The National Guard assisted with evacuations and then provided security for the abandoned homes, as well as traffic control in and around the flooded areas. Breckenridge would later see a second cresting of the river. Another phenomenon of this disaster that caused a great many problems was overland flooding. This occurred when water from melting snow moved across the flat farmland in the northwest part of the state. The water moved over land because the ground was already saturated and established drainage routes were already full. The city of Ada was flooded by overland water and the Wild Rice River. After the flood filled the streets with water, a cold snap froze it. National Guard members from the 2nd Battalion, 136th Infantry, provided traffic control and security. National Guard generators were also used to power the city's Emergency Operations Center for almost 2 weeks. Meanwhile, in East Grand Forks, city workers, residents, and the National Guard worked feverishly to raise dikes high enough to handle the predicted 50-foot cresting of the river. The 133rd Airlift Wing of the Minnesota Air National Guard assisted in this effort by hauling more than 150,000 empty sandbags from Minneapolis to East Grand Forks. The 133rd also played a key role in the flood fight by hauling National Guard soldiers from their homes in northeastern Minnesota to the northwestern part of the state. The Air Guard flew 13 missions during the flood response effort. Despite the valiant diking efforts in East Grand Forks, the river crested at an unexpected 54 feet. Most of the city was flooded. The raging waters also closed the 3 bridges that crossed the river between Grand Forks and East Grand Forks. When the floodwaters breached the dikes, National Guard soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 94th Armor, began evacuating area residents using Humvees and trucks. The National Guard used Huey helicopters to rescue people stranded by floodwaters too deep to be forded by Guard trucks. The Army National Guard helicopters also provided a valuable shuttle service across the river to Grand Forks. Many public officials used the aircraft to get a bird's eye view of the immensity of the disaster. Once the water reached its crest in East Grand Forks, National Guard soldiers controlled traffic and kept the abandoned homes secure. The Guard also helped protect the East Grand Forks police station from the river's onslaught. Guard members and city workers built a sandbag dike around the facility and used pumps to keep seeping water out. The river's crest moved through East Grand Forks and continued its journey north to Canada. Along the way, it splashed up against the northern border towns. Some fought valiantly and were able to keep dry with help from National Guard units such as the 1st Battalion, 125th Field Artillery, and the 434th Main Support Battalion. Private First Class Peggy Henrik helped stack sandbags beside snowbanks in Hendrum, Minnesota.
Well, we're building up dikes around the town of Hendrum so that when the water does come, they don't get flooded, and we're sandbagging and running pumps.
Other communities were not so fortunate and were covered by the river. By the end of April, the Guard had completed much of its flood fighting mission. By the first week of May, all National Guard units responding to the flood had returned to their home communities. The National Guard also provided support to the State Emergency Operations Center, which had temporarily relocated to the top floor of the Guard's headquarters building in St. Paul during the crisis. After the extensive use, the Guard needed to clean up and repair equipment used in the effort. It also began an after-actions review to evaluate its efforts. In its analysis of the flood response, the State Department of Emergency Management found that the National Guard performance was outstanding throughout the operation.
Oh boy, we've had hundreds and hundreds of troops, young people out there carrying sandbags, driving trucks, going through the ice. Without the troop and our Guard equipment, we wouldn't have been able to make the public safety rescues. I was involved last Wednesday as I flew up to Breckenridge, or Tuesday when I flew up to Breckenridge, a rescue mission by the Guard helicopter. There was a family stuck in a house where the water was rising up around them and there was about an inch of ice. There was power lines all over the place, and we had 2 warrant officers that were pilots, and they landed their military chopper. I say landed, maybe the wrong word. They set it down on the ice, and this person walked across the ice about 1 inch thick with 4 foot of moving water underneath it. The pilot just balanced the helicopter, 7,000-pound helicopter, on 1 inch of ice. This person walked out and got in the helicopter, and they lifted off without touching any of the wires. They were totally surrounded by power lines. We would have not have done that. That person possibly could have been a victim if it wasn't for the Guard's assets.
I just want to thank them very much, because they set down in an extremely tight spot right in our fence line, and I was a little worried that they were going to hit the blades up on a couple of fence posts we have that are probably 20 feet in the air, but he stuck it in there just like a needle. A very, very good pilot. They risked their lives, I think, to get us out, so I'm very, very thankful.
In the end, the National Guard had more than 3,000 members on state active duty during the month-long effort. It evacuated more than 6,000 people, 500 of whom were rescued by helicopter. During the course of the operation, the National Guard deployed hundreds of pieces of equipment, including more than 250 trucks, 93 power generators, and 69 pumps. This was the largest state mission in the history of the Minnesota National Guard.
They were willing to take on whatever task needed to be done, and we heard absolutely nothing but praise from the Minnesota citizens and the local governments about how when the Guard showed up, things all of a sudden fell right into place. And that's really nice to know, because that's a good reflection on us, it's a good reflection on the Guard, it's a good reflection on the state of Minnesota.
The National Guard has long been admired for the contributions it has made to national defense. With its response during the floods, the Minnesota National Guard also showed the state and the nation that a strong, community-based defense force is vitally important, especially during disasters such as the floods of 1997. The Minnesota National Guard, always ready, always there.